Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you this morning. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the agriculture agent with the Cooperative Extension Service here in Buncombe County. I'll be your host today. We will make time throughout the program for questions, and we invite you to put your questions using the chat box. I want to welcome you to Saturday seminar, Gardening in Earthboxes. Our speaker today is Debbie Green. Debbie is a lifelong gardener who bought her first Earthbox about 25 years ago. And ever since, she has experimented with growing a variety of plants in these specialty container systems. She now grows most of her herbs and vegetables in these boxes, not only because they're easy to use, but because they produce superior results compared with growing the same plant varieties in the ground. Debbie has been a Buncombe County Extension Master Gardener volunteer for the last 15 years and spends most of her volunteer hours answering questions from the public on our garden helpline. We're excited to have Debbie Green here to talk with us about her experiences with Earthboxes. Take it away, Debbie.
Thank you, Allison, and good morning, everyone. Extension Master Gardeners don't endorse commercial products, so this is a little bit of a strange presentation here. Earthboxes have a very unique research-based history that makes them very much worth learning about. Blake Wisnott, a Florida tomato gardener, began developing Earthboxes in conjunction with agricultural engineers at the University of Florida in the late 1980s, hoping to develop a very cost-effective, user-friendly growing system. In 1992, when 19 inches of rain from Hurricane Andrew ruined his in-ground tomato crop, he started manufacturing these containers in a high-grade plastic. So in 1994, these became commercially available, and soon after that, I bought my first Earthbox. And there it is. I took that picture just a few days ago. Soon after I bought that Earthbox, I put 2 Better Boy tomato starts in it, kept a careful record of my crop, and by the end of the season, I was a total convert. I had harvested 119 tomatoes from the box. Now, this box has been sitting outdoors year-round for almost 25 years, and it's not a part of my main Earthbox garden, which was in that first slide, because of its somewhat different design. So right now, it is serving as a year-round planter for oregano. And this use shows both the pros and cons of these boxes. Pros, they do not deteriorate and they can provide a remarkable harvest. But con, if you don't take advantage of all of the Earthbox's unique characteristics, they are no different than any self-watering planter. So you don't want to end up with your Earthboxes growing a single crop like this open to the rain and so on, and we'll find out why. Now, in 2006, I moved to my current house here in Buncombe County, and this is one of my Earthbox gardens here. I brought that lone Earthbox with me, and over the years, I've acquired more boxes and tried more crops. And so today, I'm going to talk about why I rely almost exclusively on Earthboxes to grow vegetables and herbs, and you can grow other things in them as well. Although I do use the patented Earthboxes, I will discuss also how you can make some economical adaptations to the Earthboxes. In other words, you're not wedded to buying everything from the Earthbox company. You can also find examples online of people who create their own systems from scratch that are supposed to mimic the Earthboxes, but I cannot vouch for those. So you're on your own if you want to try that kind of an effort. What are Earthboxes? As I said, Wisnott was trying to develop a self-contained growing system that was both economical and efficient. What these growing systems contain are a growing medium, a fertilizer strip, lime, a water reservoir, and a mulch cover. And you can see in that cross-section that there's an aeration screen above the water reservoir that allows wicking of the water up into the planting medium. The plastic cover keeps the lime and fertilizer from being diluted by watering from the top. And it really is a totally self-contained system, except for the regular addition of water. If you buy an Earthbox, every box includes that aeration screen, a water tube, and a mulch cover. And you can purchase these systems from Earthbox with the growing medium, the dolomitic lime, and the fertilizer, but you don't need to. If you want to buy your own growing medium, lime, and fertilizer, it's perfectly fine to do it. You never have to buy it from Earthbox, and obviously by your own choice, organic and conventional growing medium and fertilizer. So if you prefer to grow organic, you can grow organic in an Earthbox. Now, there are many accessories that you can add to an Earthbox. We're going to talk about some of these. These are the ones that Earthbox actually sells themselves, just for illustration purposes. They have an automatic watering system that we're going to talk about in depth a little later. They offer differing support systems for trellising plants. They offer some models that come with casters to mobilize your garden, and we'll talk about why that might be desirable. They sell these stands to create waist-high planters if accessibility is an issue. They also sell netting and shade covers and frost covers so that you can protect your crops at various points during the year. Now, you can devise your own accessories for these as well. And that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize. Supports obviously can be of a number of sorts. You don't have to purchase one of their support systems to support your crops. And obviously, supporting your crops and trellising your crops is a very important thing. In that very first slide of my Earthbox system that you saw for a very long time, you may have noticed that there was some plastic netting. And that netting was something that I thought was very useful for a while. But I also found that putting posts in the soil around the boxes of various sorts or supports of various sorts was useful. What I've arrived at as the most useful is a system that I've had in place for a few years, which is created out of so-called hog panels. These you can buy at a number of places, and they come in a number of sizes and configurations. So you need to decide what size panel is going to be best suited for your particular garden setup if you want to use this kind of a system. And the only thing that you really need to focus on is the 4x4 opening. So the 4x4 opening allows you to give good support to your plants, but it also allows you to be able to reach through to harvest and tend your plants as you go along. Another thing that is easily adapted is the covers. And the covers, as we'll go along, you'll see more and more emphasis on these covers as critical to the success of your Earthbox garden. The covers are disposable. You have to replace them every year, and they are an added expense. Most everything else you can carry over from year to year with little addition. So you're topping up some planting medium, you're adding some more fertilizer, you're adding some more lime, but these covers absolutely have to be replaced every year. And I discovered a couple of years ago some friends who had Earthboxes using contractor trash bags to cut a cover and using bungee cords to secure the covers. I decided to try this, and they work very well. This is the end of this past growing season. My Earthboxes are sitting out there right now looking like this, with the covers in place, with the bungee cords still there. You can see that they've held up extremely well, but you can also see they're not particularly attractive compared with the commercial Earthbox covers. So it's an economical solution, maybe not as good as an aesthetic solution. So that's a little bit about what the pieces are of an Earthbox system. Why would you use them? The self-contained unit, the whole package, as we'd say, has very, very important advantages. You can have a very large harvest from a small space. I talked about my first tomato harvest. Now, obviously not every year you're going to get that many tomatoes from every variety of tomato, but you are going to get a substantially significant harvest. I have a fellow master gardener who's my domestic partner, and he has a Kennedy garden plot fairly near our home. He and I have experimented over the last 3 years buying the same plants from the same vendors, planting them at roughly the same time. And he has been convinced that hands down, the Earthbox always wins. So the Earthbox produces a better harvest from the same plants. And this is from a very small space with much less effort. Now, one of the things that you need to be concerned about, obviously, with gardening, that you don't have to be concerned about with the Earthboxes, is soil. You have to provide the planting medium, but you don't have to worry about the quality of your soil or soil contamination. And this has been a big factor for me in going with the EarthBoxes. When I moved here, I was not used to growing plants on slopes, and I was also not used to growing plants in such acid soil. I had lived in an area that also had acid soil, but it was not anywhere near as acid as the soil here. It also was much more fertile than the soil here. So the quality of the soil is definitely a factor for me. It's much easier for me to maintain my crops in these EarthBoxes. You add nutrients only at planting time. So once you put the fertilizer in that box at the beginning of the season, you don't have to fertilize again. And that's a big difference from growing in the ground. Even with a slow release fertilizer, you're often having to do supplemental fertilizing as you go along. Finally, just talking about the self-contained system, the water reservoir is great for providing consistent moisture. And this is a critical thing, obviously, for any garden. When you're using the EarthBox, that's a major factor. Now, another reason to use the EarthBoxes might be because a mobile unit would allow you to relocate to follow the sun. And this is obviously only going to work for 1 or 2 boxes. But if you have a very small area that gets good sun, or you have an area that only gets sun for part of the day, you can move your boxes around on the casters and successfully grow a crop that you might not be able to grow at one spot in your yard in the ground. Finally, back to those plastic covers. They are also important in helping conserve moisture. They mean you have no weeding to worry about. You also have much less concern about soil-borne diseases and insect infestations of all sorts. And it keeps the plants and the produce cleaner. I just happen to have a picture of some chard I picked last season. I remember from my childhood how chard was my least favorite vegetable because my father grew it and it never seemed to be anything but gritty when we ate it. In the EarthBox, you certainly want to wash your produce, but you really don't have to worry about grit and other contaminants being splashed up on your plants from the soil. What can you grow in EarthBoxes? You can grow most annual plants in this area without any trouble. I do not grow a lot of flowers in my EarthBoxes, but if you want to have decorative flower displays or you want to grow flowers for cut flowers, potentially EarthBoxes would be very desirable. I grow mostly the vegetables and the herbs. I do occasionally have plants with a long growing season. And again, a couple of days ago, I took a picture of this EarthBox that was planted last March, and there's still 2 kale plants left of the plants that were in there. That one on the left looks pretty sorry, but I can still harvest some greens from that. But I've had to detach my watering system for the winter, and I have to hand water that box anytime after frost. So that's a concern. In other climates, you can certainly use them year round if you can keep the watering system hooked up. And you can grow many more perennial plants in that kind of a situation. But here we just cannot. One thing I wanted to mention about what you can grow is you can't really direct seed in these boxes. It looks like it would be an ideal situation, but because of the plastic covers, it's very difficult to get these seedlings to grow right up through the plastic in the appropriate place that you've made an incision in the plastic. So you really need to use small transplants, and they can be very small. So you can purchase transplants, but you can also start your own from seed and use them when they show their first true leaf. I've done that with many different crops and it's worked very well. How many boxes do you need? Well, if you want to just have a little herb garden, you might need only 1 box, but you can have a whole farm. And that's what the Wisnut family farm became after these EarthBoxes were developed, a whole tomato farm of EarthBoxes. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later about this EarthBox again, this herb EarthBox, so remember it. Where can you put the EarthBoxes? Anywhere there's sun and room to grow. I'm saying and room to grow because you see how small the plants look when they're first put in the EarthBox on the left there. Once they grow to a larger size, they're going to need a lot more room than you would think from the footprint of the EarthBox. So please keep that in mind. Where can you put them? Any area that receives several hours of sun a day, or an area where you can move your mobile Earthbox to for several hours of sun a day, you must have a nearby watering source, particularly if you're going to hook up the Earthbox to an automatic watering system. You're going to have to run a hose essentially from one place to another. Also, if you're going to hand water, you need to consider drainage issues. You can put these Earthboxes on a deck or a patio or any other space outdoors, but if you're going to hand water them, they will spill out water from the drainage hole. If you have a watering system, they will not. So consider drainage, especially if you're going to hand water your boxes. And you need enough space for the mature size of the plants, both horizontally and vertically. Those tomatoes were growing mostly up. You'll see in some of the other pictures, squash and such grow horizontally as well. Most of what we're going to talk about focuses on the original size container. That was what the size of my original box was. Box also makes these junior containers, which are excellent for herbs and flowers, and these larger root and veg containers that have more depth if you want to grow root crops. I am not a big fan of the root and veg. I have tried them for a couple of years. I don't find them anywhere near as useful. I regularly use both the original and the junior size boxes, however. How many plants can you put per box? Okay, I talked about the tomatoes. This is the Earthbox company's growing plan, and a lot of these graphics are available on the Earthbox site, so don't worry if you don't get all the information, because I have a link in the handout to this growing guide. 2 tomatoes are as many as you want to put in a box. You can also put 2 eggplants, 2 zucchini or 2 summer squash, etc. 6 pepper plants in a box. And notice that for the tomatoes, you put the row of fertilizer in the front of the box with the plants behind. When you have more than 2 plants, you're going to always use the fertilizer in a strip in the middle of the box with the plants behind and in front of the fertilizer. So that's a very important factor. Again, peppers, you can grow 6 in a box, and that's a great boon. That's a very good use of a box. You can mix and match plants to some extent, so you can grow bell peppers, banana peppers, chili peppers, all in the same box. 6 seedlings in a box is also good for a lot of greens and herbs. Now, remember that little Earthbox garden. That person had put 8 plants in that box. That is a no-no. You really only want to put 6 herb plants in a box, not 8. And that would apply to any of these things. So you can mix and match your greens, you can mix and match your herbs, but you don't want to put more than 6 plants in a box, no matter what kind of herbs or peppers or greens or whatever you're going to do. Going down that same side, 10 seedlings can be put in a box if you're growing things like spinach, beets, turnips, onions. I don't really recommend growing crops where you harvest the entire plant, because then you're not using most of the box for much of the season. And in fact, the whole box might need to be replanted to use it at all later in the season, which is possible to do, but is not as efficient. You use 4 seedlings per box for cucumbers, melons, and winter squash or vining squash. Remember, I already talked about summer squash with 2 a box. 8 seedlings per row if you're going to grow flowers, if you're going to grow other certain kinds of greens, etc. And 16 seedlings, 8 per row, if you're going to grow beans, peas, corn, carrots, radishes, etc. So that's what you can put in a single box. So if you're thinking about what you might use the Earthboxes for, that gives you a sense of. Now we're going to turn to the initial setup of the garden. You saw the components, and here's how you would set up your garden. Again, these directions are all available in the handout link. This just shows you how you start to put the box together. You put the aeration screen in and the watering tube in, and then you pack your growing medium into the corners. You fill the box with the growing medium almost up to the top, and then you mix in the lime. The directions for the amount of lime are clearly specified. You want to use that amount of lime, and you want to use it every year. You top up the box with the growing medium, and then you dig a trough either in the front of the box or the middle, depending on the plants, as we just saw. Then you add the fertilizer to that trough. You cover the trough with the growing medium and you mound it up above the rim. And the mounding is very important just because that helps the top plastic cover drain any rainwater or water spillage from anywhere off of the cover. You don't want standing water on the cover. Then you install the cover and you cut holes for your plants. 2 holes or 16 holes, up to 16 holes, placed according to the plant type. Again, you want to put them relative to that fertilizer strip. You don't want to plant your plants in the fertilizer. And then you install your plants. And as I said, that would be small transplants that you want to plant in these boxes. Now, a central issue for using the earth boxes is the watering. The self-watering, self-contained system means that you have to keep that reservoir refilled every day. And that can be an issue, obviously, if you're not around. When the roots fill up those earth boxes and it's very hot, you can expect that sometimes if you're hand watering, you will have to water those boxes twice a day. So that is a lot of hand watering to do. And you cannot rely at all on rainwater. Remember, he developed this system because he lost his tomato crop to the rain. And I can vouch for the fact that when we've had a rainy season, I've had really good experiences with my Earthbox tomatoes lasting out the season and producing well compared with other people whose plants just die out before the end of the season because of the rain. But you cannot rely on the rainwater to water. And erratic water can lead to plants wilting and in tomatoes and peppers and squash, blossom end rot, which is not a good situation for your crop harvest. So what do you do about that? I have used for many years the add-on watering system that Earthbox sells. It's not the best type of watering system in the world, but it works. And it works better the way I use it. I'm going to get on to that. First, I wanted you to look at this system and see how it's set up. You do need it connected to an outdoor spigot. It has a pressure regulator, and it has 2 different types of tubing with different types of connectors, and then a sensor in each box. And the sensor in each box essentially prevents the box from filling to the overflow line. So you will never get water coming out of a box if it's watered with this watering system. If you water through the watering tube itself, you will get water flowing out of the drainage hole. And I meant to point it out when we were looking at setting up the boxes. I hope you noticed that there's a drainage hole on each box. Now, one thing that I did learn in researching for this talk that I had not realized is you can use the watering system for the junior boxes as well as the original boxes, but you need to have an original size fill tube. The sensors are only made in one size. You can include your junior size boxes in your watering system if you use a larger fill tube. The weakness of this watering system is its potential leaks. Anything you hook up to a water spigot, you're concerned about potential leaking. And this can leak from that pressure regulator. If it's under constant pressure, it will drip. It can leak if any of those connections are broken. My solution has been use that system with a timer, and that minimizes the leak risk. Any system, even with a timer, if something disrupts it somehow or detaches it, you can still have a problem with water. And I would recommend if you leave your earth boxes for any length of time, for weeks on vacation, et cetera, that you have somebody check by to make sure that you're not watering the environment rather than your earth boxes. And also remember that if you have that hooked up to your spigot, you might want to still be able to use that spigot. So using the Y connection is also very helpful. Now that I've gone through that initial setup pretty quickly and a lot of details, I thought it might be a good time to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, we had a couple of questions in the box. One is about the gap between the soil layer and the water reservoir. Could you explain why that's important?
Okay, so if you had the soil sitting in the water, you would just have a stagnant water system that would rot your plant roots. The water reservoir allows your plants to be watered by wicking the water up through the soil medium. You saw that when you set up the box, you pack that into the corners, and that's the point of contact. So that's the conduit for the water to go out of the reservoir up into the rest of the box. And that's a critical thing to make it properly aerated, essentially.
How much water does that reservoir hold?
Yes, 3 gallons. And so if you were to water them at the beginning of the season, you'd probably find that they use very little water. But if you water them late in the season, when the roots are filling the boxes and when the weather is hot, you might put a gallon, gallon and a half, 2 gallons a day in there. So that's why it's important to have either the watering system or to make sure you water every day.
Do you change the soil annually? And does crop rotation guidelines apply to EarthBoxes?
We're going to talk about both of those things. Basically, the answer to the first question is no, you don't have to change the soil. I have boxes out there that I've been using for at least 7 years that have never had the soil dumped out of and changed. I have changed the junior boxes a couple of times when I wasn't sure about the possibility of disease.
So you'll get more into potting soil and fertilizer?
Not necessarily. There is a link on the handout about recommended plant media, lime, and fertilizer. Box approves for that. If there's a specific question, I like to grow my things organically, and I like to avoid potting soils with perlite, but as long as you're not using a garden soil or a compost or anything like that, most of the potting mixes are suitable for the EarthBoxes.
Does EarthBox provide guidelines on the amount of fertilizer if you use your own fertilizer?
Right. It'll tell you use X cups of conventional fertilizer or X plus more for organic fertilizer. I think it's 2.5 cups for organic or 3 cups. I don't want to say it off the top of my head.
You mentioned not using compost. What is that about? Why not use compost?
Because just like any container gardening system, you're usually using a medium that's been developed specifically for containers rather than regular soil or what would turn into regular soil. And so you want a lighter mix that's going to support the plant growth but not get too waterlogged. Now we're going to move on to what happens after you've got your boxes set up. In-season maintenance is pretty easy aside from filling the water reservoirs. Obviously, you have to train your plants, and that's why I've mentioned the importance of considering a support system before you get started. You saw the picture of 2 different years of my growing system, and you see that the plants are kind of all over each other. So you do have to make some effort to keep things from taking over all the vertical space or all the horizontal space or whatever. You do have to inspect for disease and insect damage. So they're not foolproof in terms of reducing insect damage or disease. Walking around that small area and looking at your plants closely is fairly simple and pretty easy to accomplish. It's important to remove any diseased or damaged foliage so you don't create problems for your plants. And then obviously you want to keep up with your harvest. And I just happen to have a picture of some of my harvest on one day. That shows you some pretty big tomatoes that I grew last year, as well as cherry tomatoes. They look underripe, and really the conventional wisdom now is that it's better to pick them as soon as they color up a certain amount and let them continue to ripen because the quality won't suffer, and you have them out of the way of pests like birds and insects and so on that might damage them. This was just one day where I had some different kinds of peppers, and those are some little cucamelons. If you haven't grown those are kind of a fun crop for kids. Now, end of season maintenance. This is what you do at the very end of the growing season when frost has come, and you see that I still had those kale plants growing out there. So for me, that box hasn't gotten to this point, but I have already removed the watering system from all of my boxes before frost. I drain and store that watering system. You saw all those little connections. It's best to hang that up and get all the water out of it and then store it indoors so that it doesn't freeze or crack or anything. you need to cut back the plants. I have a very windy location, so I prefer to leave stubs of my plants. You've seen some other slides with stubs of plants in them when I was showing those contractor bag covers. That helps keep those covers from blowing off, because you want to keep them covered during the winter to keep things from getting into the soil and the soil from getting affected by rain and so on. So you leave the planting medium and you leave the covers. I just winter my containers in place. I've never made a big effort to drain them. I've never done anything except cut back the plants after I've taken out the watering system. Just leave them like that all winter long. Now, crop rotation. This is the time of year when I think about crop rotation. These are some of the major families, particularly for the crops that we talked about, vegetable crops. So the nightshade family, you don't want to put the same plants, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers in this case, in the same box year after year. Brassicas, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, many of the greens, you don't want to put those in the same box year after year. Cucurbits, the cucumber, squash, melons, again, you want to rotate those. And legumes, beans and peas, you want to rotate those. What I do is rotate my containers. The crops stay in the same location. So if you're looking at those 8 plants represented at the bottom of this screen, this is the system that I've devised that I think is best for my garden. I grow 2 boxes of tomatoes, so that's 4 tomato plants. I grow beans of various sorts. I like the Chinese or Asian long beans. So I have 1 box of long beans, which is 16 plants. I have 1 box of cucumbers, which is 4 plants. I have 2 eggplants. I have 6 pepper plants. I have 6 of the greens of various sorts, the collards, kale or chard or whatever, you can mix those. And then there's no emoji for summer squash, but I usually have a box of summer squash, so I use that cucumber emoji down there. And so 2 cucumber plants. That's what I've done. And so what I do at this time of year is I move boxes around so that I've mixed up what's going to go in each box, and I'm through with my crop rotation. Now, you could move the crops instead, but I like this system in terms of the trellising and various other reasons to have the crops in this particular sequence. Next season setup, and this is something I'm just going to be starting up fairly soon. You remove and discard that plastic cover, and that was that same box you saw earlier with the plants cut back. You loosen the planting medium. I did that the other day. And then I pulled out the large roots that were remaining. And if there had been any clumps of fertilizer, depending on the fertilizer you use, you might have a clump where that fertilizer strip is. I would take out any clumps of fertilizer. And that's the extent of 2 huge cherry tomato plants. That's the root system of those 2 plants at the end of the winter. The next season setup continued. Once I've done that, I will mix in the lime. And again, I like using a little claw like I showed in that last picture. Mix in the lime and then dig a new trench, depending on where the plants are going to go. Put it in the middle or at the front of the box. Add the fertilizer, cover the fertilizer strip, mound it up with new planting medium. That's the only addition of soil medium that I put in there, is the new planting medium, just to cover that up. Once I've added the fertilizer, add the new cover, reinstall the watering system, and then when I'm ready, I can do the plants. And if you want to grow over a early spring to early summer planting system, you can set up all your boxes, put the covers on, and just cut the places for the plants and put the plants in at the appropriate time. I wanted to devote some time to long-term planning. What I've found is it's important to fine-tune your gardening location and your plant placement. So I've been fairly pleased with that location that I've had my Earthboxes since I accrued the number of boxes that I have. So I haven't really changed the location, but I have experimented over the years with the plant placement. I certainly have expanded my system over the years. I have expanded both the number and the type of boxes, as well as the accessories that I've used, and this is something to consider. Now, if you wanted to set up a single earth box just to try them out, that might be a good way to start. Or you might want to start with 2 of those original earth boxes with a watering system, because that would be a fair amount of watering otherwise. Or 2 of the junior earth boxes to try some herbs or something without a watering system. You might want to add accessories such as some plant supports once you've got your garden going, like I did. Change the type of support system you have and experiment with new plants. Obviously, when you use new plants, you're going to have need for new accessories possibly, or new placement, or a number of things like that. So I thought I would just go through and show you some of these gardens that I've had over the last few years to show some of these issues. This was the original slide of the presentation, and that was the first year that I had the 8 boxes. 8 boxes in 2 rows, so 4 boxes per row, and those were the 8 boxes I just talked about in terms of the crop rotation. I've grown a variety of different plants in those 8 boxes over the years, and the placement has changed a fair amount. So in 2018, I had those same 8 boxes, but I had them in a different configuration with respect to the plants themselves and the support systems. This was the netting. I had the posts at each end. This was the support system with the hog panel, where I had all the posts in the back. And you can see that the plants are in different places if you were to compare directly. I also was growing some different things. I tried some summer squash, which is in the front right there, which I had not tried before in the earth box. The bush squash, I had only tried the vining squash. I pretty consistently use 6 pepper plants and 2 eggplants in the front. But I've varied the kinds of cucumbers, I've varied the kinds of tomatoes, I've varied the number of tomato plants, and so on. I did not just add these boxes in 2019, but this was a picture I took in 2019, and I wanted to mention a couple of things. Here are the junior earth boxes with herbs, the small boxes. You might notice that they have red covers. The red covers were developed primarily to grow with tomatoes. Earthbox was selling the red covers cheap because I guess a lot of people didn't buy them for the junior earth boxes. And so I just bought some red covers for that reason. The typical covers are black with a white interior. Now the netting here is not to support the plants. The netting is to keep away deer. This is the only time I've had deer in my garden this particular year, thank goodness. And so that's what the netting is for. I also wanted to point out in this slide, you see the dill in that black root and veg box. I decided to try that with herbs. You see how big the dill plants get. That's why you wouldn't want to have 8 plants in an original size earth box, including dill. That would just be way too much. And this is my most recent garden, and I'm going to end with this. It still has the 8 original boxes. I added the root and veg boxes in the foreground. It's hard to see that separately, to grow my vine squash on that, because I thought that might be a better way. I do think it was a much easier way to grow the vining squash, to put some supports on the outside of that box and grow vining squash separately, because the vines are so vigorous. That's some of the things that I've done with my earth boxes, and now I'd love to hear your questions about maintaining an earth box garden.
I'm going to start now and then go back. We have a couple of questions. One is, how important is leveling the box?
Somewhat important because of the drainage issues. So you want the box so that if you do hand water it, the water will come out the drainage hole. You could see they're not real level, but they're canted so that the drainage hole is on the upside for the most part. I make sure that I keep as much water in the water reservoir as possible. You don't want it to drain out because it's at such an angle that the water's just going to drain out.
And just to clarify about the watering, it's really from the bottom up. It's wicking out of the reservoir at the base.
Exactly. So that's why you can't count on the rain. The rain isn't going to get to it. And you don't want to water from the top because it's going to dilute your fertilizer strip and really mess up the extent to which that fertilizer is going to last through the season and be meted out in the appropriate amounts.
Now, for people that want to grow tomatoes, what advice do you have for them as far as blight is concerned, the best way to avoid blight infection?
If you're just growing tomatoes, you might want to change the soil more often. You're not going to overwinter blight in our soil here, but just for other purposes of what gets used up out of the soil and so on. I think the balance of putting the fertilizer and the lime in every year helps, but maybe just something about the soil itself, you might want to change them more often. I have found that growing the cherry tomatoes is the most fun for me in the earth boxes because I just can harvest huge amounts and get them spread out over the season. But I tried the much bigger beefsteak type tomatoes this last year with great success. I didn't get 119 of those. I won't lie about that. But heirloom tomatoes, you're going to get a smaller harvest, obviously. I would suggest that if you're going to try to grow heirloom tomatoes in an earth box, you will be more concerned about disease, and you might want to consider buying grafted heirloom tomatoes because those are supposedly much less susceptible to some of the diseases.
Absolutely. It sounds like any problem you're going to have with a plant in the garden as far as disease is concerned and insects, you're going to have it in an earth box.
But I think lesser extent because it's much easier to monitor. If you look carefully at the plants, obviously there's a big jungle worth of plants, but I have mine set up so I can walk behind that panel. And so I can look at the plants from that angle. I can look at them, very close up in a very short time.
Now, as someone asked earlier, can you use compost tea as your water supply?
I would not. They don't recommend adding nutrients except through the fertilizer strip. And so I would not. I would rely on the water and the fertilizer strip, and I would use an organic fertilizer. All of the plants you saw in my Earthbox pictures were grown with organic fertilizer strip and no supplemental fertilizer. And I think those were mostly taken in June. So those plants had all grown quite a lot fairly early in the season, were very large size and starting to produce.
Someone said that they started lettuce in a peat pot and transplanted it into the Earthbox, but it didn't do very well. Should they have removed that peat?
There's another kind of little cell type plant or two that has a webbing, a netting on it. It's a peat based thing. I would break down the edges. I would not have the edges of those pots in the box. Yeah. I've had those little peat cylinder type things where you bought a plant and somebody's grown it in that. I've tried to take those off before I put them in.
John did add that into the chat box, that it can be hard for the roots to get through that. So it's good to remove them. There are a couple of questions here about, do you buy fertilizer and planting medium from Earthbox each year?
No, I don't. In fact, I think I bought some boxes with some medium because it was a great deal on it. Because it takes about 2 cubic feet of planting medium. But no, I never buy from them. The critical thing with the fertilizer and the lime is to make sure you use a type that is suitable for vegetables or herbs or flowers or whatever you're growing, and that is a type that will break down appropriately. You don't want to use pelleted fertilizers and things like that, and you want to use dolomitic lime.
I know that Earthbox has a website and they sell all the materials there directly. There's a note here also about other similar products at Lowe's. Do you have any feedback about those systems, and can you make your own grow box?
As I said at the beginning, I can't vouch for the systems that you make on your own. And I can vouch for the fact from just having other planters that if you make a system out of a Rubbermaid container or something like that, I think it's going to break down a lot more quickly. And I don't know how frost protected it would be. So if you wanted to do it as an experiment, I don't think it's a fair test of the Earthbox. And it's certainly not going to last as long. But yes, you can go online and find many people have touted systems. My daughter was given a grow box of another type by another manufacturer as a gift, and she left it with me, and I've used that, and it's not comparable at all. I mean, the enclosed system is pretty unique. The covered system is almost unique to Earthbox, and that, I think, is the critical thing, and that's why it's so critical to use those covers, because that's the way the fertilizer system works, and the lime system works, and the wicking system works. If you're just growing things in those earth boxes without covers, you're just using them as a container, as I mentioned with the original one I have.
Back about the fertilizer, someone asked if you don't remove the soil, did the salts build up?
I have not had any problem with that. Like I say, if you go in there at the end of the season and you use a fertilizer that has some kind of ingredient that cakes up and persists, you just take that out. And at various times I've used fertilizers that have done that, and it doesn't seem to have affected the growth of the plants, that the fertilizer still has some caked up clump in there, but it also doesn't seem to have affected the future use of the soil. I tend to experiment with different fertilizers, and so I have used different fertilizers different years. I don't know if that's made a difference, but I don't consistently say every year I'm going to use a different fertilizer. It's just sometimes something is available, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes I think, oh, maybe that didn't work as well, but I can't tell because it was just one season. I have not heard of anybody complaining about that as an issue with the Earthbox.
There's other questions about fertility. The purpose of dolomitic lime, for instance, there's adjusting the soil pH and providing calcium and magnesium to certain plants like tomatoes that need that. So some of the same cultural requirements are the same in Earthboxes as in the garden soil.
Right. The lime is critical for that very reason. And the dolomitic lime is introducing the calcium and magnesium that the plants need. And that's why you need to put it in every year.
Have you settled on a fertilizer that you like?
No, I don't really have a favorite. I've tried different ones. Just depends on if there's something new and different and it's cheaper, or if it's something that sounds like it might be interesting. But I have not. I hope everybody agrees that the results look pretty spectacular in terms of the size of the plant and the health of the plants. So I've never had a problem. And my one thing would be that I've only used organic fertilizers. I don't know if I would feel the same about all the conventional fertilizers as I feel about all the organic fertilizers.
I think we've covered our questions, and I want to thank you, Debbie, for sharing what you've shared with us today. This information has been so great, and I want to let everybody know that a link of the recording to this program will be sent out to you as soon as it's available. Our next Gardening in the Mountain program is March 18th, Feed the Soil Using Amendments and Conditioners. Please visit buncombemastergardener.org for the calendar of events. We have a great lineup coming this year. And while you're there, please consider making a donation to the Buncombe Master Gardener program, which helps supports programs like this and other activities that the Master Gardeners do in our community to help support and teach and encourage our local community of gardeners. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you all were able to join us, and that concludes our program.